I'm J. Cole Thomas, and this is
Mario Hudson.
We like to have weekly discussions of what I like to call spiritual perspectives.
All right. Yeah.
It's where we try and meet in the spirit. We may talk about our individual perspectives of where we may see things ego-wise, but where we agree, where we try and come together, I think, is in the spirit of what our conversations are about.
Yes, I agree.
One thing we love to do is kind of debate back and forth on our perspectives, and I love the conversations because they help tease out that spiritual chord. I think is so important. A lot of people don't necessarily get to research for themselves to really delve into what concepts or ideas of religion or spirituality are even about.
Right.
And so we're kind of what I like to say spiritual geeks, and that, we like to dig in and kind of find out it just from a deeper level. So one of the things we talked about just last week as we were actually leaving the studio, we were talking about preconceived notions.
Okay.
And so we were saying how, looking back at biblical times, I was saying how, you have a preconceived notion actually looking at history, and you were saying I have a preconceived notion looking at history.
Correct.
Or the Bible, actually.
The Bible, right. And I think it's interesting because I was, as I was coming here today, I was thinking about that, and one of the things that came to mind was our view on the content of the Bible. As I mentioned to you before, I see the Bible as God's story. He's telling us His story from beginning to today, and indeed the end of the story. So I see the Bible as a true, factual tool that can help us define and guide our lives. So that's important to me, because one of the things that the scripture talks about is always be willing to make a defense for what you believe in. And as we talked about, you cannot defend something if you don't research it, if you don't understand it. You don't have a true essence of what it means. So without that, it becomes hard to defend, and that's why people are not comfortable engaging in conversations like we're engaging in, because they haven't invested that time to define for themselves the reason for their beliefs.
I agree. I think for people it's real hard to really dig deeper, because one, a lot of us are kind of indoctrinated into what we've been taught.
Correct.
Our grandparents, our mother, father, whatever, this is what you're going to believe, this is right and this is wrong.
Correct.
And so people really don't get an opportunity to investigate things for themselves as much as they get to just accept what they've been told.
Correct.
And especially within the African American community, what I've been born up from, I really like to probably say more black culture within America, because one great thing I think about our discussions is that you have a different background than me growing up here in America, you growing up in Panama.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I'm always looking to dig deeper into what is my own story, because we as African Americans here have our story completely wiped away,
right?
And it's been replaced with biblical history. And so,
okay.
Well, I'm saying,
and that's fair. That's fair, right? That's
from
fair.
Again, the black community
Correct.
here in America, and
Correct.
having our history replaced with biblical history, there is really no place other than maybe bad roles within the story of the Bible of where we exist as a people.
I agree.
And so to dig deeper into my own history, that now gives me a different perspective of biblical history, because now I have to see what the history of Africa is, and even what the history of the Europeans that forced their view upon us, where it comes from. And that kind of shapes my perspective again, of where I just go back and look at the historical record.
Right.
And going back and look at the historical record, or what I would say is the linear perspective of religion. Mm-hmm. Right? Religion, as you say, it's God's story from start to end.
Right. It's interesting what you're saying, because as I shared with you my history, being from Panama, and when I came to the U.S., I saw African history differently. Because one of the things that I first dealt with was this concept of African American history. Because the question of America is a continent, it's not a country. And in effect, the concept of African American history in the US is limited to the country. Understanding that the events of slavery and other things existed all over America, and in effect, the level of disgust, I would say, that was introduced into slavery in America was, atrocious. And as you're saying, one of the things that has helped me over time is to not look at the Bible from a Euro or a Afrocentric perspective, because as we do that, and as you mentioned, the Eurocentric history is wrong. It's distorted. It's twisted. But changing the Eurocentric perspective to fit the Afrocentric perspective is also wrong. So the question then, is there a centric perspective that's correct? And that's what I believe. I believe there's a theocentric, a God-centered perspective that takes out that cultural bias and distortion that even today people use to justify their beliefs. I go back to a question I asked myself. If we look at Christianity and all of the denominations that exist today in Christianity, is that a biblical teaching? Is that concept that Christianity exists divided is something that Christ himself taught when he was here? And the reality is, yeah, he taught that Christianity would exist divided, but not as the concept he thought, but as the distortion introduced by men. Whether it be a Eurocentric perspective, an Afrocentric perspective, an Asia-centric perspective, whatever perspective that was introduced, it was not back to the God-centered perspective that was the intent, I believe, when the Bible was introduced to us.
To have an Afrocentric perspective that changes the biblical perspective. To have an Afrocentric perspective is not necessarily to change Eurocentric perspective. It's to put the linear track actually in line. Okay. If we're speaking of a story, then we're talking linear. Okay. And linear meaning, this time to this time. And so if we're speaking of this time to that time, then my time as African history of their contribution to the story comes before the Eurocentric history. And looking at it from that is what shapes my perspective differently. Okay. Because what I see is that most people don't see this in peace. They see it from this middle ground from just 2,000 years ago. Right. And from there, now they're speaking of ancient history and so on and so forth with no knowledge of the history that has come before that time. And so the Eurocentric perspective, what we understand today, are the perspective of the barbarians at the gates of Rome, not the perspective of Romans.
Okay, not quite a clear, not sure I understand that. Why don't you expand on that a little bit for me?
Romans have a different view of history and the world that they lived in. They didn't view it as so flat, so one-sided before they began to become unbalanced. Because as they went out, their great message, same as Muhammad and even Alexander the Great, of joining and being a part of something, okay, as opposed to, you're just my subjects to be enslaved. Because Romans had this different understanding, they respected the different people they ran into when they first encountered them. They didn't go and slaughter the lands of folks. They went, they gave them a choice. They said, join us, or we'll let you have it.
Right.
And most people who looked at what they were bringing, what they were saying, they said, "Oh, you know what? We'll join. We cool." And when they did that, they respected the treaties. They let people still believe what it was that they wanted to believe. They just had to now become a part of the Roman citizen, pay tribute to Rome. That different perspective of seeing people as part of Rome, not as these separate races or separate entities, that's a different perspective than Europeans who now saw themselves as the dominant ones here on earth. They had dominion to be able to go and do what they will upon the earth. And a lot of what they were doing was going to find out who they were. They had no idea how they got to be Europeans. And so that's the medieval history that most people lead from, is this medieval history that says, you know, oh, everything started here, 2000, and what happened beforehand, you know, that was just ancient history. You know, we can't really speak to it. If you listen to some people, they would have you believe that the 3,000 years before, 0 BC, CE, whatever someone said, it's just this great mystery. And thanks to Europeans looking to find out who they were, they've been able to help explain to me who I am.
Right. You know, the one thing you brought out that is very interesting is the order of occurrences of events. And I think as you just finished your statement as to 0 and what happened pre-0 and post-0. And in effect, one of the comments you made about Rome, I remember, and I had to look it up. I remember reading it in the Hebrew scriptures that God, whenever people went into battle, as you mentioned, that was one of his conditions, that the people were given the opportunity to join, and I will use the term surrender, but more important, to join and become part of the nation rather than fight and be killed. So the concept, as you're describing, was part of those laws in the early days that God provided to his people as a guidance, not to go out there and kill and slaughter, but in effect create a sense of unity by allowing people to surrender and join. So,
which book are we talking about?
I got to research it.
Old or New Testament?
Old Testament, yeah, the Hebrew Christian, absolutely, Old Testament. And to your point, that's where a lot of people, the Christians today, some Christian religions today, disregard the Old Testament and call about the New Testament, and in effect, as you always say, using certain principles to justify war and destruction, when Christ himself preached love. Christ himself preached forgiveness. Christ himself discouraged people from retaliating even when they're stricken. So I agree with you in the order of occurrence is very important in all our history. And again, that's why I go back to the God-centered perspective, because I believe he is in effect providing that clarity as to how these events occurred and how they will occur in the future. You know, clearly the Egyptian or African history predates, as we call, European or white history. I mean, that's a clarity, and I think anyone that take the opportunity to research will see that. And as I shared with you, one of the things that drove me to some of my research on my Afrocentric view in the past is truly understanding who I am, but more important, understanding why it was important for them to distort who I am. Okay, and that provided me a great perspective in understanding that the history that I need to know, there's good, powerful. Matter of fact, some of the things I found out, blacks invented stuff that I didn't know. I mean, stuff like the stoplight and the headlights and some very fundamental things that we see today, where if you ask an average person, whether black and white, they have no idea who invented it. But if you ask a white, They're going to think a white person invented it because that's what they've been indoctrinated to believe. If you ask a young black person that they don't know, they will think a white person invented it. Because again, as you mentioned earlier, that's the indoctrination that we've conditioned to believe. We've been conditioned to believe that these things are true, even though they may not be factual. You know, and again, I go back to my research into the Bible. Again, trying to understand God's truth drove me to recognize where there is a lot of things in the Bible that people misinterpret, completely misinterpret. And if they were to do the research, they would recognize that what they believe to be true is in fact not true.
I guess I have a question. When we say Afrocentric history, does that make you envision like kind of black power symbols, like power signs, in the sense of saying, you know, black is beautiful and they're the superior as opposed to white?
Well, you know, it's interesting. As part of the research, I questioned why was the concept of Afrocentrism itself, why did it even come up? Why was it explored? And it was, in effect, I believe, was something started out as a element of research for me, but then I think I came up to the conclusion that it was intended to instill pride in people from the African perspective, but yet became distorted to where it became a ideology of superiority.
Well, again, that Afrocentrism, I believe, is more of a black American need to be white, so, you know, emulate the culture that they've been taught. Right. And so people who see it from a white supremacist perspective, being taught in a white supremacist perspective, want to take on the role of a white supremacist. Okay. That's why I don't believe that there is a such thing as a white person or a black person, because there's all shades of people, even within so-called races of people, there's still, you know, all these different shades. What we understand today, again, is there's just a melanin count that people have in their skin, and that's all due to where they are. But even that distortion of people thinking that we're different in the sense of human beings, right? There's only one race, that's the human race. But people want to say, oh, well, you know, there's this people and there's those people and so on. So we're just speaking culturally. There's these people and there's those people. Culturally, they might have different identity or ways of identifying themselves. But one of the biggest things that is distorted, I would say, within history itself is, like you said, what comes from African time, African civilizations, what contribution to the great world ego that we see today, right? What everybody in a sense believes about themselves and where we are and what time it is. What is the contribution that African civilization has contributed to world history? And that is where I more or less see it, in a sense, not to say Afrocentric history, meaning that, you know, these people are more powerful. For them, I believe, again, that it's all a cycle, it's all connected. We are one race, and so being one race, it's all one story, as you say, with the Bible. It's just my story has to connect these people's stories together because we're one people. That's sort of the limitation that I have or kind of see within some people who see it from the biblical history of it, is that there's only these people's history that matter. And when I look at biblical history, they don't talk about African civilization's role in things. And if we know that it comes before everyone else, then looking at it from the same European perspective of lesser than, not good, negative only, then it makes me question how it's presented within the Eurocentric Bible that presents it as Pharaoh and all these people have, when again, their civilization shows a level of civility, a level of peace that no other Eurocentric civilization shows. And these people, again, what their history has to say contradicts the biblical timeline. Not in a sense to say the biblical story, because for me, as I see it, as cultural tales, again, stories that were important to different people. This is what we call scriptures. Any sacred text to an individual is a scripture. And so as these scriptures have been put together, then these people, medieval Europeans, have come together with their Bible. But other people have come together with their own books, which I don't disrespect. I don't look down upon. I see it as their inner spirit speaking out. Now, how their ego may interpret that inner spirit is different for each of us. Right. That's sort of the blessing of this world, is that we have free will to express ourselves in the way we express ourselves. It's unfair to be down or to say one person's way of expressing themselves, one person's way of spiritual expression, spiritual show, if you want to say, you can't necessarily put down if their spiritual show shows a lot of love, a lot of civility, a lot of calm coming together. And I said a lot.
No. I really enjoyed what you said, and a couple of things I want to touch on. And again, always coming back to, as you pointed out in the beginning, our common knowledge, our points of agreement. And that is, there's only one race. And that's a race, as I go back to the Bible story, that's how God defined it. One race, one people, created in the garden, and from those people, the entire family exists today. All of us, part of the same family, different shades, but the same family. But also what you said is each one of us have a different story in that process. And again, I go back to the Bible. It talks about different stories. It talks about Cain, Abel, Seth, Abraham, Noah, all of these individuals having a story told within the Bible. And to the point you're making, the Egyptian story is in the Bible. Hey, again, as you mentioned, it may be distorted, it may not be distorted, but the point is, all of the different cultures, all of those different stories are in the Bible to some extent. And the question then becomes, why are they in the Bible? Are they in the Bible to show us that all of them are okay and acceptable? Are they in the Bible to tell God's story that people culturally will, as you mentioned, use their free will, use their ego to redefine love, to redefine righteousness, to define right, wrong? Are people going to use, and do we see that throughout history? Do we see that what's considered by some people to be good or bad to others? And one of the, and I'll use this analogy here, and we talked a lot about it, the existence of good, bad, the existence of righteousness and unrighteousness. And for me, one of the fundamental elements of the Bible story is that exact point. It's that struggle, that battle from the beginning of that drive, or that ego, as you said, an ego that was created in God's image, an ego that was given the free will, but an ego that's also influenced, according to the Bible story, according to what I believe, by Satan, or more important, as we used to say, by that alternate side of us, that part of us that want to make that choice, that side of us that wants to redefine what love means to us. What I'll use an example. I had a recent experience with a friend of mine, and he was in trouble. And he got in trouble for a choice he made. And I said to him, I said, look, this choice got you in trouble. I think you need to step back from it, understand why you made that choice. Understand what motivated you to make that choice. Understand why that choice was wrong. And then go back and understand how you need to change your way of thinking, so that next time that choice comes up or something looks like it comes up, you can now reason on it differently. Because I think the biggest struggle we all have, and I was reading this the other day, and it really drove me home. It says, what gets us in trouble is not what is really true, but what we believe to be true. And indeed, those two are not necessarily the same thing.
You know, I love what you just said. We agree at least a good 90% there. There's two things that I want to address. One is, you says about redefining love, and the other one I might have lost. But if someone else,
Righteousness is
righteousness, unrighteousness,
right.
Good, bad,
right.
That struggle, that struggle. That's the two pieces I want to address.
Okay. All right.
The first, people redefining love. If someone tries to redefine gravity, does that mean that they don't fall? No. They still will fall. Mm-hmm. They still, and so people redefining God's principles, which I believe, and I believe we believe, are universal. Mm-hmm. Right? The universe is what it is. Man did not create it. Man has nothing to do with the clockwork of the universe. Right. And so, men trying to redefine what is clear to everyone else, and just to say in the sense of gravity, it doesn't matter. They're still going to fall. They're still going to smash their face.
Correct.
The importance of that is that there is that understanding, misunderstanding, mm-hmm. right? Which one is love? Understanding, as what you just pointed out. If you understand your choice, you're empowered. Mm-hmm. If you don't understand your choice, you're lost.
I agree.
And so these principles, that principle there, that just simply exists there as consequence, something we talk about over and over again, right. that consequence exists, and thereby men can go out and try and redefine love and say whatever they want to, but the outcome, the manifestations of things within their lives is the manifestation of things in their lives.
And we see it.
That tells you, if they're loving or if they're not loving. Right. And so that takes me around to one more thing I guess I want to drop, because that was quite easy for me to say. Is it about our actions in this life? Or is it about what we believe in this life?
Well, it's about our actions, but our actions are driven from what we believe.
Right. And so if our actions are leading to misunderstandings, then shouldn't that make us question what it is that we believe?
Whoa. Consciousness requires that piece of Jesus Christ. See, one of the things that I do believe is I believe that people are, as you would say, I believe you have said this, walking around unconsciously in misunderstanding.
Yes.
So if they're in effect fooling themselves that they are in understanding.
So there is again my point of it. Is when people take it from a biblical perspective, they believe they understand it all. They've got it all. It's all right here. All I got to do is follow X, Y, and Z as my pastor or someone else tells me, or this and that. I just need to go out and do these things, and now everything is all right. And whatever the outcome that's happening in my life, being humdrum, that's not necessarily the concern, because a lot of these people are looking to what happens once they die, as opposed to what's happening while they're living.
Right. From a biblical standpoint, as you pointed out, I believe there is understanding in the Bible. And I believe that, yes, over time. Yeah, right. So that there is misunderstanding. Okay. Now, to your point, if there is misunderstanding, if the consequences in your life reflect negatively, then it's your responsibility to go find that understanding. And I'll use the point of love, and I use this because this is probably one of the key scriptures that changed my perspective. And it's in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 13, and it talks about love and what love is from God's standpoint. That it doesn't look for its own self-interest, that it's forgiven, that it looks for the interest of others. Truly looking at love in how you can share it, not get it. Okay? And that's how I learned love. That's how I learned that I was not loving my wife according to biblical principle. I was loving her in the way I misunderstood love. Or, more important, I was loving her the way I understood love in my own self-interest. So for me, that's why I go back to doing the research, studying the Bible, trying to think about it from God's perspective, not man's perspective, not my pastor or anyone else's perspective, but God's perspective. I think I remember one time I was sharing something with someone, and I told him that, and I wouldn't say I told him, I read that the Bible, as we read it, is God's story told to us on that moment, based on our understanding, because all of us don't gain the same understanding of the concept of the Bible, because there's a level of maturity that we all have to go through. And the problem is when we start putting in a lot of put a misconception in it, and rather than honestly starting to let the word change us, have the power of God change us, we begin to change the word of God to make it fit our need. So for me, as you pointed out, looking into the Bible for those understanding, for those principles, learning those principles, and then applying those principles in our lives leads to the action that we need to have. An action that honors God, an action that gives us the best life now, and an action that gives us an opportunity for a future in a paradise that God's promised us. So clearly, I believe that it's critical for us as individuals that want to please God and want to live the best life possible. It's incumbent on us to go out there and gain that understanding, gain that knowledge, unencumbered by our preconceived ideas, unencumbered by our cultural influence, unencumbered by our ignorance, but truly seeking out God's truth, God's knowledge, God's guidance in the best way of life for us now. And I think, as we said last time we spoke, I don't remember, if all of us were to just simply, and I'll just say, apply 50% of the love that Jesus talked about in our life, can we just imagine what difference we would experience today? Not even 100%, even 50%, if all of us were to unselfishly love each other. Imagine the change, imagine the power, imagine the color blindness that we could achieve right here today.